On a summer morning in the hills outside Glonn, southeast of Munich, a dairy farmer named Beate Greithanner was walking her cattle across a meadow her family had crossed for generations. One of her cows stepped forward, and the ground swallowed it to the hips. The earth had simply opened. Beneath the grass, running under her own land, was a labyrinth of hand-carved passages that nobody alive had known was there. It runs at least 80 feet. It is most likely 1,000 years old, and it is one of roughly 2,000 of these tunnels hidden under the farms, fields, churches, and forests of Central Europe. Around 700 of them sit beneath Bavaria, another 500 beneath Austria. The rest are scattered through the Czech Republic, Slovakia, France, and as far as the British Isles. The people who dug them left almost nothing behind. No blueprints, no letters, nothing written down to explain the work. They carved the walls smooth, threaded the passages, with holes so tight a grown man can barely force his shoulders through, sealed each system behind a single concealed entrance, and then walked away. Why would anyone do that? Today we are climbing down into the Erdstall, the medieval tunnels that an entire continent dug by hand, hid on purpose, and then refused to explain. How does a continent carve 2,000 tunnels and leave no answer? To see why that question is so hard, you have to start with the tunnels themselves, because the design is both the first clue and the first problem. An Erdstall is usually a single narrow gallery cut into soft workable ground, loess or clay or soft stone. The ceiling sits between roughly 3.5 and 4.5 feet high, low enough that you move through it bent double or down on your knees. The walls pinch into about 2 feet across. Most of them run no longer than 150 feet before they dead end. There is one way in and the same way out. No back door, no second shaft, no through route of any kind. The Austrian researcher Herbert Wimmer spent years sorting them into types, from simple straight galleries to multi-level mazes with side chambers and loops. But the family resemblance holds across all of them. Same low ceilings, same pinched walls, same dead ends. Then comes the strangest feature of all. Researchers call it the schlupf, the slip-out. It is a tight vertical or horizontal hole, often only 15 or 16 inches across, that connects one level of the tunnel to another. To pass it, you push your arms through first, then your head, then you twist and drag your shoulders through a gap barely wider than your own body and haul yourself up into the next passage. Think about that for a second. Someone designed these tunnels so that moving through them would be physically difficult on purpose. And once you are inside, there is almost no air. A single entrance and no second opening means no draft and no circulation. The deeper chambers go stale fast. Modern explorers crawling these systems report headaches and shortness of breath within minutes and have to back out. Whatever the Erdstall were for, comfort was clearly not part of the brief. Most of them are too narrow for anyone to visit at all today. Only a handful, like the Ratgerblucken at Perg in Upper Austria, were ever cut wide enough to walk through, and that one is the exception that proves the rule. Here is what makes them genuinely maddening to study. They are empty, not robbed, not stripped by looters. Swept clean. Across 2,000 sites, almost nothing has ever been found inside. A few iron plough blades, a couple of millstones, scraps of charcoal and pottery near the mouths of the tunnels, and then bare rock everywhere else. Whatever they once held is simply gone. People built these with enormous effort and left them spotless, which is the exact opposite of how human beings normally treat the spaces they actually use. And here is the other strange thing. We almost never find them on purpose. We fall into them. The way they turn up, again and again, is by accident. A plough snags on a hidden cavity, a farmhouse cellar is renovated, and a sealed passage opens behind the wall. A cow drops to its hips in a meadow. These tunnels were tucked under the floors and yards of old farmsteads, beside village churches, near cemeteries, on the gentle slopes where medieval people lived and worked. They were under the houses the whole time. Their builders just made very sure they would stay out of sight. But this was never really about one farmer's field. The scale of it is the part that should stop you cold. Carving an Erdstall by hand was brutal work. The diggers used simple iron picks and shovels, working by the light of small oil lamps set into niches cut along the walls. You can still see those niches today, and you can still see the marks the tools left in the rock. A single system took weeks of labour in cramped, suffocating darkness. And this was not one village with an odd local habit. The same design, the same dimensions, the same impossible little slip holes repeat across hundreds of miles, and at least 7 countries, built by people who in most cases never met and never could have coordinated. There was no emperor ordering this, and no decree from the church behind it. The impulse came from the ground up. Ordinary rural people, separated by mountains and languages, independently dug the same secret tunnels to the same strange specifications. You would think someone, somewhere, would have written down why. Nobody did. We can at least pin down when. The dating is hard, precisely because the tunnels are so empty, but the few scraps of datable charcoal and pottery all point the same direction. Charcoal from a fire pit at Bad Zell in Austria dates to between 1030 and 1210. Charcoal from a dig at Höckelmühle in Bavaria falls in the late 10th to mid-11th century. Stones added to narrow a slip passage at Rot am See date between 1034 and 1268. Pottery at Sankt Agatha lands in the 12th century. Put it together, and the great age of Erdstall building runs from roughly the 10th century through the 13th. The first time the word itself appears in writing is later still, in a tax record from the Austrian town of Aspern in the year 1449, which names the ground above the tunnels as the place on the Erdstall. By then the digging had already stopped, and the memory of why had already begun to rot away. Stift Göttweig, Lower Austria. 1878. A Benedictine priest named Lambert Karner climbed down into his first Erdstall and never really climbed back out of the subject for the rest of his life. The locals called him the Höhlenfahrer, the cave priest. Over the next 25 years, with backing from Emperor Franz Joseph and the Imperial Academy of Sciences, Karner crawled through and carefully measured more than 400 of these tunnels, most of them along the Austrian Danube. In 1896, he took the first photographs ever made inside them. In 1903, he published everything he had found in a book titled Künstliche Höhlen aus alter Zeit, which translates as Artificial Caves from Ancient Times. More than a century later, it is still the foundational work in the field. One priest with a lamp and a measuring tape mapped more of this mystery than almost anyone who came after him. And Karner, the man who knew these tunnels better than anyone alive, looked at the most popular explanation for them and threw it straight out. The obvious guess, the one you probably already had, is that they were hiding places, escape tunnels, refuges from raiders. Karner studied the actual design, the single entrance, the dead ends, the suffocating air, and concluded that as hideouts they made no sense whatsoever. The first serious expert on the Erdstall spent his career proving that the easy answer was the wrong one. Step back and look at the whole map for a moment, because the theories about these tunnels fall into 3 camps, and each one fails in its own instructive way. The first camp says refuge. This is the theory that refuses to die, and it has a serious modern defender. The Austrian researcher Josef Weichenberger argued the tunnels were temporary hiding spots for peasants during the violent centuries when settlers were pushing east into contested land. To test it, he spent 48 hours inside one. He found that in the tight sections the lack of oxygen wore him down within hours, and he could breathe comfortably only after moving into a wider chamber. That is the generous reading of the evidence, and it still runs into a wall. The wall is the design, the same wall Karner hit in 1903. A hideout with one entrance and no second exit is not a refuge. It is a trap. An attacker does not even have to come in after you. He blocks the single hole, and everyone inside suffocates in the dead air. As a survival strategy, that is a disaster, and there is a timing problem stacked on top of the design problem. The raids people usually picture, the Hungarian horsemen who terrorized Bavaria, were broken for good at the Battle of Lechfeld in the year 955. Yet most of the tunnels were dug in the centuries after that, when the Great Raids were already history. For a long time people assumed the refuge theory had the whole picture. It does not. To be fair, recent 3D scans of some Austrian systems have turned up the remnants of wooden doors and post holes, barricades that could have sealed a passage from the inside, and that has given the refuge idea a second life among some researchers. But a barred door does not fix the airless dead end behind it. The core problem stands. The second camp says storage. Cold, dark, stable in temperature. Ideal for keeping food. It is a reasonable guess that collapses the moment it touches the evidence. The passages are far too narrow to move goods through easily. Many of them sit low enough to flood with groundwater in winter. And across 2,000 sites, the hunt for any trace of stored food has come up essentially empty. You do not build a pantry you have to crawl into on your belly, and that fills with water half the year. We have now ruled out the two practical answers, and that is usually the moment a mystery like this gets interesting. A quick word before it does. If forgotten medieval craft is what brought you here, my shop was built for you. At medievalway.store, you will find the medieval bakery collection, the sourdough manual, the practical recipes book, and the sourcing guide, the lost techniques these people actually lived by, rebuilt for your own kitchen. The link is in the description. What comes next is the part that still does not make sense to a modern mind, and it is the explanation most scholars now take most seriously. The third camp says the tunnels were never practical at all. They were spiritual. The leading theory today is that the Erdstall were religious spaces, and the version that fits the evidence best is genuinely unsettling. The historian Anton Haschner proposed that they were soul houses, empty symbolic tombs that medieval settlers dug in their new villages as dwellings for the souls of their dead, places where the ancestors could wait out the long stretch until the Last Judgment. That would explain the emptiness, because you do not furnish a house meant for souls. And it would explain why the building tradition died out, because it lines up with the spread of the Church's doctrine of purgatory in the late 11th century. A new official idea about where the dead actually go that would have quietly made the old soul houses pointless. It would even explain the schlupf, that punishing little slip hole, in the eeriest way of all. Some researchers read it as a symbolic birth canal. You crawl down into the dark, you force your body through a gap barely large enough to pass, and you come out into the next chamber reborn, leaving sickness or sin behind you in the earth. The difficulty was not a design flaw. The difficulty was the entire point, a physical ritual of death and rebirth carved by hand into the ground. Others see something gentler, a kind of prayer architecture, the branching passages and chambers working like the beads of a rosary, or the winding path of a cathedral labyrinth, each turn a station for a specific prayer. The lamp niches that lit the digger's work could just as easily have lit a penitent who crawled down with nothing, feeling for the walls in the dark. Think about what it would take to believe in something strongly enough to dig it by hand, in the cold and the black, for weeks. There is even a quieter fourth idea, floated at a 2014 gathering of the people who study this for a living. Maybe the Erdstall were simply bad houses, underground dwellings that someone started, discovered were unlivable, and abandoned once the flaws became obvious. It is the least romantic theory on the table, and nobody can rule it out either. Because the truth is that the people still chasing this, a loose network of speleologists and historians who call themselves the Working Group for Erdstall Research, meet year after year, crawl into fresh systems with 3D scanners and headlamps, publish their findings, and come back to the same annual table, no closer to a verdict than Karner was in 1903. We cannot prove any of it. That is the honest verdict, and you deserve the honest verdict. There is no surviving document from a single digger telling us what these tunnels meant. Every theory, refuge, storage, soul house is built on a structure that was deliberately swept clean of the one thing that would settle the argument. Which brings us to a discovery from just months ago, one that makes the mystery deeper rather than simpler. In late 2025, in Saxony-Anhalt in Germany, archaeologists working ahead of a wind farm project found an Erdstall that had been dug straight into the interior of a Neolithic tomb, a burial monument already more than 5,000 years old when the medieval diggers arrived. The pottery in the fill is unmistakably late medieval, so the tunnel itself is not ancient. But the people who carved it chose, out of an entire landscape, to drive their passage into the heart of a place that had been sacred to someone else thousands of years before them. They felt the pull of that ground across 5 millennia, and they answered it with a shovel. That detail matters because it cuts hard against the wildest claim in this entire field. A handful of writers, the geologist Heinrich Kusch the most prominent among them, have argued that the Erdstall are not medieval at all, but Stone Age, the surviving fragments of a vast prehistoric tunnel network supposedly running from Scotland all the way to Turkey. The radiocarbon dates and the medieval pottery simply do not support it. The tunnels are medieval work, full stop. But the Saxony-Anhalt find shows the medieval builders standing on top of something genuinely prehistoric, reaching back toward a sacred landscape far older than their own faith. The Stone Age network is a fantasy. The Stone Age pull on these people may have been very real. Strip away the goblins and the gnomes, the dwarf legends that still cling to the local names, the Schratzloch, the Goblin Hole, the Alraunenhöhle, the Mandrake Cave, and you are left with something more unsettling than any folk tale. The legends ran deep enough that one tunnel near Lindau carries a small goblin-like figure carved into the sandstone, as if the builders themselves were nodding to the little people the stories said lived down there. But the folklore is only the residue these tunnels left in local memory. Underneath all of it, you find ordinary medieval people across half of Europe, with no central authority telling them to, who spent enormous effort carving thousands of nearly identical secret tunnels. They built them to be physically punishing to enter. They used them for something they cared about deeply, and then they erased every trace of what that something was. The emptiness is not an accident of time. It looks like a decision. These tunnels have outlasted the kingdoms, the languages, and the beliefs of the people who made them, and they have kept their secret the entire way through. We can measure them to the centimetre. We can date their charcoal to the decade. We still cannot tell you what they were for. The real question was never how medieval peasants dug 2,000 tunnels under Europe. We know how. They did it with iron, lamplight, and a patience most of us have lost. The real question is what an entire continent believed strongly enough to build in the dark and guard in silence for 1,000 years. If you have a theory of your own after all this, put it in the comments. I read them. Subscribe, and let's keep digging up what they buried. Until next time, stay curious about the ground under your feet.